Clash over Syria's future. Two opposing visions, one allied with Turkey President Erdogan and adherence to Islamic law, the other espousing secularism, human rights, and an equal role for women. Which future will Syria embrace, and what role must the United States and Israel play? Joining us with more from Jerusalem is Middle East Quarterly editor and journalist Jonathan Spire. Jonathan, you've just returned from the Kurdish Autonomous Region of northern Syria with the Kurdish leadership and members of the Syrian Defense Forces. So are they hopeful that a new government will include them, or do they fear ongoing fighting with Islamists and the Turks?
Well, I would say that the official version, which you hear from the very top officials, or at least which I heard from the very top officials of the SDF, of the Syrian Kurdish leadership, maintains a tone of optimism, or at least neutrality, regarding that the direction of events. But I think as soon as you speak to anybody who's not sort of being very careful to give you that line in the Syrian Kurdish areas, then what you actually hear is a tone of very deep concern, whereby what they'll kind of tell you is, yeah, we know these people. We know who Jabhat al-Nusra, which then became Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, are. We know that these are Salafi jihadis. We know that these are people who in their not too distant past were burning churches and were committing atrocities against Kurds and other non-Arabs or non-Muslims. So actually they're very deeply concerned, I think. And I think, in fact, many of them will tell you that within a year or two, they expect a kind of test of power between the two, whereby HTS, as it indeed says it's going to do, will try one way or another to force the Kurdish-controlled areas back under the control of Damascus. And the Kurds, certainly if they're forced into that situation, intend to contest that.
Syria's interim leader Abu Mohammed al-Julani has expressed gratitude to Israel for weakening Iran and Hezbollah's influence in Syria. What do you see developing with that relationship? Friendship, neutrality, hostility?
I find it very hard to believe that there will be friendship. It is worth remembering that in the not distant past at all, prior to November of this year, when of last year rather, when HTS began its march, its remarkable march on Damascus. But prior to that time, HTS was controlling, of course, an enclave in Idlib province in northwest Syria, which it controlled for 7 years prior to 2024. Leading leaders and so-called spiritual leaders in that space were strongly supportive of the October 7th massacres and are on record as being so.
Al-Julani recently met with Turkey President Erdogan. How great is Erdogan's influence on Al-Julani? And to what extent do you expect him to be involved in brokering the nation's future?
First of all, it needs to be understood that Julani and HTS's triumph is equally a triumph for Erdogan. What I mean by that is that had it not been for Erdogan's stubborn and, as it turns out, prescient insistence on not abandoning that little 10% enclave in northwest Syria that he kept control of, at a time when throughout the region and indeed throughout the world, including in the West, people were saying, no, the Syrian war is over. Assad has won. Why is Erdogan insisting on keeping this little dusty enclave of jihadis going? Well, it turns out that as a result of his doing that, his allies, let's say, ended up in control now of most of the country.
Initially, President Trump sounded like he was indifferent to what was happening inside Syria, and he suggested, well, Turkey has wanted to control parts of Syria for years. He's even suggested withdrawing U.S. troops from bases there in the northeast. What should he do about Syria in the days ahead?
Well, let us remember that there is roughly around 40,000 ISIS and ISIS-associated prisoners currently in the hands of the Syrian Democratic Forces inside Kurdish-controlled or SDF-controlled north and eastern Syria. There have been a series of ISIS attacks in Syria over the last months. There, of course, have been ISIS and ISIS-associated attacks in the United States in the same period of time. So on the most basic level, it is, I think, a U.S. interest to make sure those 40,000 prisoners don't go free. I was just visiting one of the internment camps of those ISIS prisoners, the Al-Hol camp up in northern Syria, close to the border, just a few weeks ago. And people there were telling me that the prisoners there were jubilant when they saw Jolani's people marching into Damascus because they considered that, okay, Damascus is free now, so-called, and will be next.
It seems that al-Jolani has done what ISIS could not and may be on his way to creating a Syrian caliphate.
I think that's right in a lot of ways. I think Jolani's career is remarkable in the following way. The usual pattern for Salafi jihadi Islamists of that type, and ISIS were, and bin Laden of Al Qaeda was as well, is that as soon as they get any strength on the ground, which they can do through their military determination sometimes, then they turn out to be geopolitical lunatics. And what they do is they then pick a fight with forces vastly stronger than themselves and are then subsequently destroyed by those forces. That's what happened. That was the trajectory of bin Laden's career. That was the trajectory of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and Islamic State's career. And the remarkable thing about al-Jolani and HTS is that they have managed to pursue a different trajectory, whereby once they achieve political power, they then actually use it smartly as opposed to crazily.
And I'm sure Israel is watching developments in Syria closely. The Kurds want them to be involved as well, not just the U.S. What can and should Israel do at this point to influence the new regime?
Regarding influencing the new regime, I think that Israel is limited in what it can do because Israel doesn't have, ways of influence into the kind of circles of which Ahmed Shara al-Jolani is a part for kind of obvious reasons. Israel can do what it's currently doing, which is it can ensure that Israeli communities in the Golan Heights are kept safe because Israel has kind of carved out a small buffer zone of its own inside Syria, same in a way as the Turks do in the north, or arguably the Americans do in the east. And if the Shara government in Damascus becomes hostile, then, Israel will take such measures as it deems necessary. In the past, against Assad, against Hezbollah, against the Iranians on Syrian soil, Israel was very determined. And I'm sure that Israel will pursue an equal determination to ensure the safety of its citizens against any other government in Damascus that may turn its hand against it.
Okay, we'll see what develops. Jonathan Spire, thanks for being with us.
Indeed.